Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Sam Koslowski.
Nepal's government has lifted a controversial social media ban after deadly protests swept through the country, killing 19 people. Thousands of young demonstrators took to the streets of the capital, Kathmandu, demanding an end to government corruption and the reversal of restrictions on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok and other platforms. The protests have been dubbed as the country's Gen Z uprising and represent some of the worst unrest Nepal has seen in decades. In today's deep dive, we will take you through everything you need to know about this social media ban and the protests it inspired, as well as the government's response and backflip.
So, Em, this is a story that has developed quite quickly over the past few days. I find it really helpful when we do stories such as this one to really get a bit of a snapshot into the political dynamics on the ground in Nepal. Nepal is not a country that comes up in the news cycle a lot. Give me a sense of what sparked these protests in the first place.
Yeah, so this all relates to a decision by the Nepalese government to ban 26 major social media platforms. Officials essentially had put out a notice for social media platforms to register with its Ministry of Communication. A deadline was set back in August, and essentially the government was arguing that it would set up this infrastructure, these channels to handle hate speech and fake news and crack down on online misinformation and disinformation, as well as fraud. But critics had suggested that this was more about an attempt at censorship, a way to control free speech. So there was that deadline that I mentioned, and on Thursday last week, the government announced that it would be blocking social media platforms that failed to register by that deadline. Now, this included pretty much every platform you can think of: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, even WhatsApp, X, LinkedIn, and Reddit. So a really far-stretching ban.
So it doesn't isolate a particular company like we've seen in other regulatory efforts. This was a ban on pretty much any social media platform you could think of.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I think it's surprising to see the likes of LinkedIn included in these sorts of bans. But it is important to note, in terms of, your question, Sam, about a snapshot of Nepal, about half of Nepal's 30 million people have internet access, and more than 70% of the country's internet traffic comes through social media platforms.
Wow.
Now, those who have opposed the ban, including these protesters, have described these platforms as really critical communications channels for many Nepalese families.
Talk me through that. So that we're talking here about more of a demographic argument then.
Yeah, exactly. So I did not know this before, but was fascinated to learn that about 8% of Nepal's population, that's over 2 million people, live abroad, mostly as migrant workers. Now, many families in Nepal rely entirely on platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger to stay in touch with their relatives who work overseas. So when the government suddenly blocked these platforms, it cut off communications for millions. But there's also a really crucial economic stability angle to all of this as well. According to World Bank data, the money that these international workers send home to their families in Nepal, what's known as personal remittances, that actually accounts for over 33% of Nepal's GDP. It's the highest that figure has ever been. So there's a really critical economic link between Nepalese families in the country and their relatives abroad, financially and from a communications perspective.
Which in some ways is universal. I mean, in countries, both emerging economies and established economies, social media and instant messaging is used for many economic reasons, as well as keeping in touch with families.
Yeah.
And so then this led to the protests that broke out on Monday. Were the protest organisers and those who attended the protest, were they driven just by this social media ban? Or was this kind of the tip of the iceberg for this group?
Yeah, exactly. This isn't just about social media access. This ban has really become a catalyst for protests that follow much deeper seated issues. So we're talking about allegations of widespread government corruption, what protesters have described as a lack of economic opportunities for young people. That ties into the idea that, millions of Nepalese people are leaving the country to find work. And Nepal has seen frequent changes in government since its monarchy was abolished established in 2008. So it's really faced a period of political instability pretty much ever since independence was achieved. I mentioned corruption. One protester told local media that videos had emerged on TikTok showing kids of Nepalese politicians living lives of luxury in a country where the per capita income is just over 2,000 Aussie dollars per year.
So there's some pretty deep-seated and historic anger that's coming through in these protests. Social media gets switched off and then these protests emerge quite quickly.
Yeah.
What happened at the protests themselves?
So the demonstrations started at 9 a.m. local time on Monday in central Kathmandu, and thousands of young people had mobilised, gathered at that time, many of them students in school uniforms or wearing their university logo and merchandise. And they were holding signs that read things like "Shut down corruption, not social media," "Unban social media," "Youth against corruption." The protest was organised by this group called Hami Nepal, which means We Nepal in English, and they'd actually received official permission to hold this rally. So it wasn't a surprise that demonstrators had turned out, but as the day went on, things really escalated.
Well, what you're talking about there is the violence that we've seen at the rallies. Was there a moment where things did turn violent?
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
Yeah, so the protest moved towards the Nepalese parliament, and that's where some demonstrators kind of broke through police barricades. They entered this restricted zone. There was vision circulating showing groups of young people climbing the walls, trying to enter parliamentary buildings. And it was really at that point that authorities reacted with quite strong force. A curfew was imposed in parts of the city, and police used water cannons, tear gas, rubber bullets to try to disperse the crowds. But then, really distressingly, and according to multiple reports and eyewitness accounts, police began to fire live rounds of ammunition at the demonstrators. By the end of the day, hundreds of people were injured and at least 19 people were dead, 17 in Kathmandu and 2 in the eastern city of Itahari.
Talk me through the international response to this then. Live rounds on protesters escalates protests, no matter where they are in the world, to attract international attention. What's the reaction been?
So the UN Human Rights Office said it was shocked by the killings and injury of protesters. It has urged what it called, quote, a prompt and transparent investigation. And the UN said it's received several deeply worrying allegations of unnecessary or disproportionate use of force by security forces during the protests. So the UN has called on Nepalese authorities to, quote, respect and ensure the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. Then we had Amnesty International release a statement which said it strongly condemns the unlawful use of lethal and less lethal force by law enforcement in Nepal. It said the government must genuinely listen to the legitimate demands of the youth to end corruption, deliver accountability, and ensure civil liberties instead of melting out such reckless violence against them.
Well, let's talk about that government response then. There were clear calls on the government. Have they responded to both the social media ban and the protests themselves since Monday?
Yeah, so in the initial aftermath of these deadly protests on Monday night, as the death toll was rising, as this story began to make global headlines, the country's Prime Minister, KP Sharma Oli, called an emergency cabinet meeting. Then we had a statement in which the PM said he was deeply saddened by what had happened, but ultimately he blamed what he called, quote, infiltration by various vested interest groups for the violence. He didn't specify who these groups were, but he also said his government was, quote, not negative towards the demands raised by the Gen Z protesters. Initially, there was resistance within the government to lifting the social media ban. We had some MPs saying that they were doubling down, that they were not going to wind it back just because of this unrest. Some reports suggested the Prime Minister himself was strongly opposed to reversing the decision, but ultimately it was reversed.
And that all happened yesterday.
Yeah.
So the ban is now no longer in place.
Exactly. So less than 24 hours after the deadly protests, the Communications and Information Technology Minister announced that the ban had indeed been lifted, telling Reuters, quote, "We have withdrawn the shutdown of the social media. They are working now." So all platforms back online.
Okay, so where does this all leave Nepal now and the Gen Z protesters, as they've been described in international media? Where do things go for the country?
Yeah, so the government has announced a high-level probe committee to investigate the incident. That will have to submit a report within 2 weeks to kind of give its assessment on what happened, what led to the deaths, analysing the use of force during demonstrations.
Right.
And the government has also promised compensation for the families of those killed, as well as free medical treatment for the injured. And it is worth noting that the bill cited as the basis for the social media ban, it hasn't actually passed Parliament yet. So I'm sure there'll be more protests, more demonstration, more action as we wait to see the fate of that piece of legislation unfold. But, you know, these issues remain largely unaddressed. And I think it's been particularly fascinating to see the voice of young people, of Gen Z protesters, elevated on the world stage. And this kind of activism, you know, really can be a wake-up call. So I'm sure this is not the last we will be hearing about this one.
I mentioned before, but I think it's just so interesting that the international coverage of these protests really is leaning into this phrase of the Gen Z protesters. And it's not the first time in the world that we've seen this age group do widespread protests and demonstrations. It's the first time I can remember that there's a really strong link between those protesting and the generation that they represent.
Exactly. Fascinating.
Really interesting. Thank you so much for taking us through that, Em. And thank you for joining us on the Daily Aus today. We're going to be back in the afternoon with your headlines. But until then, have a wonderful Wednesday. We'll chat to you later.